The Tom Woods Show, episode 1847.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, as you know, Harry's is the official razor of The Tom Woods Show, and for a limited time, Harry's is offering their starter set plus a free body wash for just $3 at harrys.com/woods. That's over a $16 value for just $3 at harrys.com/woods. Hey folks, Tom Woods here. Bob Murphy's back on the Tom Woods Show here. You'll recall Bob Murphy and I used to have a podcast together, Contra Krugman of happy memory, and we now have separate podcasts. It's not because we couldn't get along, but poor Bob was juggling 3 podcasts at that point. I mean, come on. Give the guy a break. But he's got the Bob Murphy Show now, which you should definitely be checking out over at bobmurphyshow.com. Bob holds his PhD in economics from New York University. He's the author of, 217 books or something like that at this point. His book, Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, got more praise from economists than really any book I have ever seen in our circles. I mean, there are people in the Austrian world who don't get along. Let's just put it that way. But they all agree that Bob Murphy's book, Choice, is absolutely outstanding. It's like Mises, but easier to understand and in fewer pages. It's such a well-done book, but there's so many other books that and incredible array of articles and videos from Bob. The work he's done over the years is really, really important and of very, very high quality. And we're going to talk today in particular about a book of Bob's in the Politically Incorrect Guide series. Now, I was the author of the first of the books in that series, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. But today we're going to talk about Bob's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide. Well, he wrote 2 in that series, didn't he? The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. But today it's The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Bob, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're a real sport, Bob, coming on to talk about a topic whereby we get to promote a cartoon show that Michael Malice and I are doing, but that's the way she goes. The Regnery folks who published our Politically Incorrect Guide books gave their blessing to the Politically Incorrect Guide animated series that Michael and I are doing, and our second episode has to do with the Great Depression and the New Deal. And, what does Malice know about any of that? Well, we all know the answer to that. So that's why we got Bob Murphy coming in here. Pinch hit and talk to us about it. So you are one of a select few, maybe just you and Brian McClanahan, who wrote 2 titles in the Politically Incorrect Guide series. You did the one on
I didn't know
capitalism.
Brian had written 2. I'm walking around thinking I'm the record holder.
Oh, no. He did one, the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Founding Fathers, and then one on Real American Heroes. So, yeah, it's a tie. Okay.
So I have to go write another one and then make sure an accident happens to Brian.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to walk back that victory lap you took when you thought, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. I got to get Brian back on the show someday. But anyway, the point is, let's talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And we will, later on we'll see, is there any contemporary relevance to this? I mean, to me, one of the key things that's relevant about it, it's not so much that we're facing exactly the situation that they faced in 1929, everything like that, but rather that this is the case of a particular version of events becoming the conventional wisdom, and no matter how many problems there are with it or how compelling the alternative version, it's very, very hard to crack through. I mean, most people read in their textbook that capitalism run amok caused the Great Depression, and thankfully wise government intervention directed us out of it. Now, we have overturned
Can I just
this.
mention, Tom, too,
Yeah.
I remember when I was, I don't know if I was junior high or high school, but when I was getting into free market economics, that was a major stumbling block for me, is that I, quote, knew, because I had been taught, that, yeah, we had capitalism in the 20s, and look what happened. And that really was. And so when I read Milton Friedman talking about the Fed, and, I'm sure we might get into that and how the Austrians differ from Friedman on that, but I was, in a sense, like, oh, okay, yeah, so it wasn't the free market's fault. Okay, so now my worldview is coherent. Right,
Exactly. Now, the thing is that because since then, people like you and me have responded to this so many times, we might have this sense that, well, a lot of Americans already understand this. It's almost none. And I think, I can't remember when it was, I think I told the story, but I can't remember when. But back when I was on with Sean Hannity promoting the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, and he said he had never heard the argument that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs may have delayed the economic recovery from the Depression. He'd never heard it, even though it's an absolute staple of the political tradition he's supposed to be a part of, at least, the intellectual tradition. This stuff goes back to the 1930s. You read some of the commentators then, not just John T. Flynn, but a bunch of others. He'd never heard of this before. So we have a lot of work to do. So let's talk about it. Let's start with this. I know it's a hard one to start with, but why is it wrong to say capitalism caused the Great Depression?
Okay, so I think a two-pronged answer. So obviously what I'm saying here flows from me being an Austrian economist, and so I'm going to assume for the moment that their analysis of the business cycle is correct. So, why is it that we had the stock market crash in 29, and why was it that there, quote, had to be a very bad downturn in the late 20s, early 30s? It wasn't because of wildcat free marketeering. It wasn't because, normally back then, in the 20s, they didn't have any curbs. The SEC didn't exist, and people were just buying stocks on margin. And don't you see how that? And incidentally, just a lot of the conventional stuff as to explain, well, of course, we're going to have a Great Depression because look at how unregulated stuff was in the 20s. Well, the economy was that unregulated for all of American history. So it doesn't really explain why was there a bad crash in 29 to just say, well, because the SEC didn't exist. Because it's not that the SEC had existed and then Calvin Coolidge got rid of it. That's not what happened. So I would say the reason we want to explain why was there such a big boom-bust cycle that crashed, in 1929, famously, I would say it's because of the Federal Reserve. And you can go through and look at the history of that, and you can see, what happened there. There was a big run-up in prices, money and credit during World War I, right after the Fed was founded. And then there was the Depression of 1920 and 21, which you and I have talked about, Tom. And so that same pattern repeated itself. There was a big inflation during the 20s and then a crash. Again, this is just standard Austrian business cycle theory. But why was it then that we didn't just have a 2-year depression the way the 1920-21 episode occurred, and when most people might not even know there was a depression at that point? It's because what was unique was that Herbert Hoover, in office when this crash happened, did not sit back and, quote, do nothing. I would say the single biggest mistake he made was pressuring businesses in conjunction with labor unions to not let wage rates fall. And so he famously had a big conference right after the stock market crash and called in people. And because Herbert Hoover had this theory that what happens in a depression with a small d, or a panic, as they would sometimes call them, is that it was a downward spiral. That, businesses get panicked, they start laying off workers, but now workers don't have wages, so they can't buy things, so prices fall, so then businesses lay off more people. So he just thought it was this vicious downward spiral. If you could just nip it in the bud and just tell businesses, hey, at the onset of a downturn, just keep wage rates where they are. Don't lay off workers, don't slash wage rates, then everything will be fine. Like, you won't have this downward spiral because the workers will still have enough money to buy stuff, right? And so that was a mistake, that prices crashed, as they often did. It's just habitually in terms of these cycles at that point. But then wage rates couldn't go down. And so if you just think about it, you've got revenues falling to businesses while workers still stay as expensive as they were before. So they're artificially getting more and more relatively expensive. And so, of course, that's why you're going to have massive unemployment. So to me, it was a two-pronged thing. So it wasn't the free market because, number one, the boom-bust cycle was because of the Fed. And number two, if it were just the Fed, then yeah, you would have had a bad crash in 29, but it would have been relatively quick, just like it had been throughout, a lot of U.S. history. But again, the difference was Herbert Hoover came in and did all sorts of things that we can elaborate on if you want. But to me, that's the issue. And again, my takeaway for people who think, oh, come on, you guys are just grasping around. Whatever you want to say about how laissez-faire the Hoover administration was, all earlier U.S. administrations in peacetime had been more laissez-faire. So it's really not a good explanation to say the reason the Great Depression happened was because Herbert Hoover was unwilling to do things.
Right. And you're right that we can indeed go through and make a list of some of the things Hoover did. I would recommend on this, of course, a book by a certain person, namely Bob Murphy. Your book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, does go through in some detail what Hoover did. And you're right. Okay, maybe it's not as much as Obama would have done, but it's way more than anybody else ever did. And as you say, previous downturns did correct themselves. So what was the problem in this particular case. And the difference is that you have activist Hoover and then even more activist FDR. And the thing is, people will say, well, correlation doesn't prove causation. All right. Well, look, if it were reversed and this was the one depression where indeed the government really did do nothing, and then it was the worst one, do you think these same people would have all these subtle distinctions about correlation not proving cause? No, of course not. They would say, look, we didn't do anything, and the result was the depression lingered for years and years. So it's like there's a double standard going on here.
Yes, there often is. Yeah, and it's, Herbert Hoover in his memoirs says, let me just give one quick example, because people might be like, no, what are you talking about, Murphy? I know, I've read things like his Treasury Secretary said that we need to, have a... what was it? Do you remember what I'm talking about, Tom?
Oh, was it the thing about liquidate labor?
Yeah, right.
Liquidate
liquidate stocks, liquidate labor, and everything. We used to have big blowouts. And so people will quote that and say, oh, this was from Herbert Hoover's own, Brad DeLong did this. And as you may know, Tom, I'm not a fan of that man. But this was the episode where I was just like, I cannot believe he did this as a scholar. So he would quote from, Herbert Hoover's own memoirs to say the advice he received behind closed doors when the stock market crash happened. His Treasury Secretary Mellon saying, just liquidate labor, liquidate stocks. That's how you deal with something like this. And then DeLong moves on, leading you to believe that's what Hoover did. When in the book, in the memoirs, Hoover on the very next page says, but I told him, no, we're not going to do that. And instead, we had the greatest counterattack of economic relief in U.S. history, or, that's not an exact quote, but that's something like what Hoover. So just I'm warning people, if you ever hear that particular factoid that, oh, look at Hoover admitted that his own, what his policy was liquidation. No, he brought that up to tell the reader, I did not do that. And it wasn't just him covering his butt. Like, you can go through it and, I document in the book. And I think you and Michael, mentioned some statistics in your episode showing that, no, any metric you want in terms of increasing government spending, increased deficits as a share of the economy. I mean, these things, so they did more during World War I, but in terms of, and probably in the Civil War, but in terms of peacetime, U.S. government activism, clearly the Hoover administration was the most activist in history up to that point.
And I can't remember if we put it in the episode, but I know you put it in some of your writing. If you compare things like, I guess it was maybe the deficit as a percentage of GDP or something like that, you compare it to somebody like George W. Bush, who everybody knows was a spendthrift. Mm-hmm. I think Bush comes out looking relatively okay. At least if Hoover is supposed to be stingy, the numbers don't add up. It turns out that they're quite comparable.
Right, and people remember what I was doing in that article is I was going after Paul Krugman, another one of my favorite economists, who was trying to he was writing columns saying things like a tale of the 50 Herbert Hoovers, and he was complaining how state governors, a lot of them had balanced budget amendments and things. So this was in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And so Krugman was complaining that, the state and local couldn't run big deficits. So they were like Herbert Hoover, who famously in 1932 raised taxes to try to reduce the deficit. And the reason Hoover did that was because he had tried for years running big deficits and they weren't working. And then finally, he wasn't a socialist. And so he said, okay, we can't just keep running a bread ink. We got to close this shortfall. And so, what I was doing was showing Krugman, who also had earlier during the George W. Bush years been lamenting these profligate Republicans who are starting a war in the Middle East while doing tax cuts. That was a popular refrain from Krugman and other leftist liberals in the George W. Bush years. And so I was showing, like you say, Tom, that the deficit as a share of the economy was, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was certainly comparable in the Hoover term and George W. Bush, right when liberals were complaining about how reckless this was. And yet Hoover is this tight-fisted, balanced budget man, and George W. Bush is this reckless, oh my gosh, cutting taxes when you start a war? What are you, out of your mind?
Now, you said initially that you were going to give a two-pronged answer. Now, my gut tells me that one prong is the stuff we've been talking about now, about Hoover and FDR. But the other prong would be, I presume, what happened in the 1920s that culminated in this collapse. Am I right?
Well, I don't want to embarrass your gut, but what I meant was that the two prongs were, one, the boom-bust wasn't from capitalism. That was because of the Fed.
Oh, okay,
and then
okay,
given that there was, but even that's not enough. Given that there was going to be a boom bust, then the federal government didn't just sit back and do nothing.
Right. So I want to go back to that first prong. Because the first prong is I think people are probably equally unaware of either prong, but this one they really are. Because there are some people, let's say, who aren't in the tradition of Austrian economics who might well agree with us about the interventions of Hoover, the interventions of FDR, that these were problems and so on and so forth. Like, I'm not sure that Jim Powell, for example, is an Austrian necessarily, but he's very critical of FDR for some of the same reasons that you and I are. But now let's give it the full throttle explanation by talking about the 1920s. The 1920s, the impression people have is that it was a very laissez-faire time in American history. So if you're going to say that even that wasn't pure enough capitalism, if we're going to come along and say, well, you can't blame capitalism for 1929 because there was intervention in the 1920s, people are going to say, well, then we're never going to have the kind of capitalism we need to avoid these downturns. So you're just being unreasonable. What was going on in the 1920s that could have set this up?
Okay, so on the one hand, and it is important we do talk about this because this is a huge difference between like the standard Chicago school or monetarist economists and the Austrians. So normally, in terms of assessing the interventions of Hoover and then certainly FDR, Chicago school and Austrians are pretty similar. But in terms of diagnosing, what went wrong, why was there the 29 stock market crash, that sort of thing, they're diametrically opposed. So in a nutshell, someone like Milton Friedman argued that, the reason we're even in this mess in the 30s in the first place was because the Fed, they fell asleep at the wheel. That Benjamin Strong, who had been the leader, he died, and then there was a power vacuum, and they didn't know what they were doing. And so Friedman's explanation is during the 20s, anytime there was any sort of downturn in the stock market or tightening or whatever kind of measure or indicator of economic weakness, the Fed would loosen up and get through it, and it was fine. But then disastrously, the Fed tightened, or at least passively tightened, in 28, 29, and that's what ultimately led to the crash. So in Friedman's view, the only reason we had that crash was the Fed inexplicably tightened. And again, he attributes it to the personalities involved and stuff like that. And, partly the inexperience. They didn't really know what they were doing and that kind of thing because the central bank was a new institution at the time for Americans, relatively new. Whereas the Austrians say almost the exact opposite, that Murray Rothbard argued in his book, America's Great Depression, and he spends a lot of time. Rothbard doesn't even get to FDR in that book. He just talks about the 20s and what happened and then the Hoover administration. So Rothbard says the opposite. He says, no, the Fed inflated too much. And so in other words, the Fed blew up a giant asset bubble in the 20s with loose money, and then of course it was going to pop. Now in terms of the timing, once the Fed blows up a giant asset bubble, when does it pop? Well, when the Fed tightens. But it's not like you could just keep blowing it up forever. In the long run, ultimately the dollar would crash if that's would collapse if that's what you were doing. So again, just the two different views. The Milton Friedman types say the Fed tightened for no good reason, and that's what caused the downturn, caused the 29 stock market crash and everything. And the Austrians say, no, given that the Fed inflated this bubble with loose money in the 20s. So as far as like the background of that, I'll try to tell a real quick version of it. Remember, so in World War I, most of the belligerents went off the gold standard, the classical gold standard. The U.S. nominally stayed on. They restricted exports and stuff like that of gold and things, but the U.S. kind of stayed on it, whereas all the other major belligerents totally severed their currency's ties to gold. And then, so Britain, printed up a bunch of pounds, and the pound fell against the dollar in terms of, the pre-war parity. And they wanted to go back to that in the 20s. And so there was an explicit agreement. This isn't a conspiracy theory, and this is on paper. Everyone agrees with this, that the people running the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve had an understanding that the U.S. would have an easy money policy in the mid-20s to make it easier so that Britain didn't have to go through as much of a painful deflation in order to get the pound and dollar back in the pre-war parity. So that was part of what was going on. And so, yeah, you can see that there was, when the Federal Reserve in the 20s engaged in loose money, that it fueled an asset bubble. And so that's, it wasn't just, unregulated stock market speculation. It was the entity that was in charge of creating dollars, started creating more than usual, and that fueled an asset bubble. The last thing I'll mention, too, is this isn't merely after the fact Austrians fumbling around with a story like, well, we got to blame something, so let's blame the Fed. That Hayek and Mises, have things in writing during the 20s where, they know a great crash is coming. Okay, so some people like to say, they predicted the Great Depression. And when you go look at the quotes, it's maybe not as airtight as you'd like, but certainly Mises and Hayek have stuff in writing knowing that the mere fact that like CPI inflation was pretty stable during the 20s did not mean the Federal Reserve was conducting good monetary policy. So that's, again, another huge difference between like Irving Fisher and the Austrians, is Hayek and Mises knew that the Fed had loose money in the 20s, whereas Irving Fisher was looking at CPI and saying, no, it's pretty modest, so the Fed's doing a good job here. They're just keeping prices stable. And Mises and Hayek were saying, no, consumer prices really should be falling because the 20s, it was the roaring 20s. Real output. Calvin Coolidge had great fiscal policy. He was having budget surpluses, I think, every year he was in office. So there was a lot good in terms of supply side Austrian theory in terms of the U.S. policies during the 20s. But the one asterisk to that was that they did have loose money from the Federal Reserve. And Coolidge himself, I think that was a blind spot. Like I remember reading his analysis and whatever, that he didn't realize that was a thing. And that's, I think, was his downfall, because otherwise, yeah, he really did have a pretty good, laissez-faire administration, paying down the debt from World War I and whatnot. But yeah, the Fed was really loose, so that blew up an asset bubble that then popped in 29.
Hey, folks, let's take a break to thank our sponsor, Harry's, the official razor of the Tom Woods Show. You want to be a real, authentic Tom Woods Show listener, and you're a man, which, by the way, is highly likely if you're a Tom Woods Show listener, then Harry's is the razor for you. Now, I'll tell you something. There have been numerous times, because of travel or what have you, that I haven't had access to my Harry's razor. I think, it's okay. I'll just go down to the store, get some bargain razor somewhere. Oh my gosh, it is like some kind of CIA interrogation chamber with some kind of instruments of torture. It's unbelievable how much I benefit from Harry's. And it turns out that Harry's is not one of these expensive razors with a million different features. All I want is a sharp blade and a good, close, comfortable shave. And that's what Harry's gives me for just $2 per refill. So for a limited time, Harry's has an exclusive offer for listeners of my show. New customers can get a Harry's starter set and a free body wash for just $3 at harrys.com/woods. That's over a $16 value for just $3. You get a 5-blade razor, weighted handle, foaming shave gel, a travel cover, and a travel-size body wash. It's an incredibly great deal, but act fast while supplies last. Go to harrys.com/woods to redeem your offer. And interestingly, Warren Harding, who is, not very highly rated by historians, let's say, for obvious reasons.
I mean, how many people did he bomb?
Yeah.
How good of a president could he be?
He was just a regular guy who wanted to smoke and drink, and he didn't really want to remake the world, so we have to hate him. But yet, as I found when I started writing about this years ago, if you read his acceptance speech that he gave when he got the Republican nomination, and then his only inaugural address, you get the idea that he and he wrote his own speeches, as far as I know. I think he was one of the last to do that. But if you read these speeches, you get the sense that he's not an economist, but he has a basic understanding that, look, there's been a lot of crazy credit creation, and there's been, let's say the prices of some things have been pushed up to levels where they can't be sustained, and some businesses are not going to be able to survive in the new context. And the correct way to do this is not to keep trying to artificially pump up the current system. It's to let it adjust to the present conditions. And so we're going to have a deflation, and this is going to be okay. This is just an adjustment of the system, clearing out bad investments and stuff. I mean, he has a pretty good, that's better than anything I've ever heard any other president say about stuff like this. That's not bad. I noticed there's kind of a parallel
here. Hey,
here.
Tom, are you talking like in the context of the 2021 depression he was
Yes.
saying? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, he was very good on understanding that. But the parallel that I have in mind is with 2008. So 2008, people like Peter Schiff, who's a very free market economist, was predicting that something like the housing bust was going to happen. He predicted that. So it's interesting to note that, as you say, Hayek and Mises were saying, well, a crash is coming. If it really was true that we had radical deregulation leading up to the housing crash, and if it was really true that the 1920s was just wild laissez-faire, why were the proponents of laissez-faire the ones pointing out that a problem was coming? Obviously, they perceived something other than laissez-faire going on.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah, so, hello. So that's what I always say.
My thing, too, with that is, if you had asked a left-wing economist or just a pundit in, 2005, and say, hey, why is it that we have the FDIC? Why do we have the SEC? Why do we have Fannie and Freddie and the privileges they get? They would say, well, you certainly couldn't have just complete deregulated financial markets. Do you know how crazy that would be? That's why we have all these wise government systems in place, so that we don't have crazy unregulated capitalism. You know what I mean? In other words, before it blew up, they would have been quite sure that these programs were all good and that they would have said, we don't have laissez-faire capitalism because that would be a disaster. And then yet what stuff did blow up is, oh yeah, we basically had anarchy. So
yeah, exactly. Apparently for years and years and years, nobody did anything about that, right? You had Democrats in power throughout the 1990s, and apparently nobody noticed that it was the most radical capitalism of all time. All right. Now, I guess we do want to just say, I mean, we've kind of been dancing a little bit around it because every single time you bring this up, you do have to, I think, say something about the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Now, we've kind of hinted at what that amounts to, but can you, for the 1,827th time, just run us through a thumbnail sketch of it?
Yeah, sure. So, and I should clarify, even though before I may have given the impression that, oh yeah, the Austrian theory says that the central bank comes in and causes business cycles. That's actually not what it says, and it's a good thing because then that would mean, so if a business cycle happened before the Federal Reserve in U.S. history, there goes your theory, right? So that's not what I'm saying. Strictly speaking, what the Austrian theory, which was developed by Ludwig von Mises, elaborated on by Friedrich Hayek, says, this is the way I would put it to someone who's hearing it for the first time. Look, interest rates are prices, and they serve a function, just like oil. Whether oil's $20 a barrel or $100 a barrel, certainly that information means something, and you couldn't just have some central board of petroleum planners saying, oh, well, let's stimulate the economy by making oil $10 a barrel for now. That would screw things up if that's not the right price. And so likewise, now it's not as obvious to see, well, what do interest rates, what do you mean their prices, what do they do? Like, whereas you understand what the price of oil does, but they do something. They have a job to do in a market economy. And so if the banking system floods the economy with, let's say, artificial credit or credit that's not tied to genuine saving, and that pushes interest rates artificially low, then that causes problems. That screws things up. It causes distortions. And specifically, Mises argued that when interest rates are pushed to artificially low levels, if they're lower than they should be, then entrepreneurs start longer-term projects than they ought to. Just, when you're assessing the profitability of a project, especially a long-term one that, involves a lot of resources going in perhaps for years, and then the finished product comes out at the end of the pipeline, maybe a decade down the road, the interest rate is a very important consideration in assessing whether that's a good project to undertake or not. And so if interest rates are artificially low, more entrepreneurs are starting long-term projects like that. But if the reason the interest rate dropped isn't because households save more, but just because the central bank, for example, creates money sort of electronically through bookkeeping operations, there's nothing real backing up those long-term investments. And so there's misallocation, there's what Mises called malinvestment, and it can give a short-term period of prosperity because you've got all these entrepreneurs starting long-term projects, they're hiring workers, bidding them away from their existing jobs. How do you get workers to leave their current job and go to something new? You have to raise wage rates. And so that's why the boom period feels good. It feels prosperous. It seems like everything's humming and every business is expanding, but it's built on quicksand. It's an illusion. It's a false prosperity. And so at some point, that those real misallocations manifest themselves. The chickens come home to roost. It typically happens when the banking system sees inflationary pressures and panics and tightens up, and that's the immediate trigger. But Mises is saying it's not tightening per se. That's the trigger. That's the timing of the downturn. But the real problem is actually the boom. It's the boom where mistakes are made that eventually have to be washed out during the bust phase. And so that's kind of the operation. And so the central bank just serves to mute the normal market checks on that kind of activity. So normally in a market without a central bank, the banking system can't inflate too much and can't push interest rates too much below where they ought to be, whereas the central bank comes in, cartelizes the banks, acts as a, quote, lender of last resort. So if you think about all the things that would normally prevent an individual commercial bank from overextending itself, the very official function of a central bank is to reduce those limits, right? The central bank is going to be a lender of last resort. So no, go ahead, make loans. And if you get caught with your pants down, we'll bail you out because we're a lender of last resort. So that's actually, during the good times, making banks less responsible, making them more willing to take a risk on something. And so when you're after the fact, when you're trying to understand, man, why are we so crazy during this boom period? How come everything went to our heads and we lost all sense of reality? The central bank actually is one of the engines driving that.
So this goes to show why it is that you can't have an informed conversation about an economic downturn without talking about the Federal Reserve. You cannot have that conversation. And yet that's exactly what so many people tried to do after 2008. Thankfully, Ron Paul was around, because normally the Federal Reserve would never have been mentioned in a political campaign. We're supposed to, that's the experts running the economy, people. We don't need to criticize that. That's not a political issue.
And it's so boring, that topic, right? Like,
right.
Geez, what people, I mean, I just take I think for me, for sure, and I think you too, Tom, right? Like, I thought Ron Paul was making a strategic mistake when he was emphasizing the Fed. I thought he should talk about bringing the troops home and legalize pot. And nope, and the Fed was the thing that caught on and got the kids fired up.
It's incredible. Yeah, honest to goodness, I've never been happier to be wrong in my life than finding that turned out to be a winning issue for a lot of people. You can't have this conversation when we're talking about the Fed. And then meanwhile, you got the left, and they're all outraged about injustices in the economy, and they're silent about the Fed. I mean, I cannot imagine that this institution and what it does wouldn't at least make you curious? I mean, these are the people who are supposed to question authority, and instead they're going to say, well, this is a giant institution that is the head of a system that basically cartelizes the banking system and props it up and provides this and that special privilege to it. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure there's nothing to see there.
And you can also look at its balance sheet, and you can tell when wars are by looking at the Fed's balance sheet. So that it's not just that we're like grasping at straws. Like, clearly the Fed is the thing that pays for wars in the short term, in a sense. So, especially if you're a leftist, peacenik kind of person, like, yeah, the Fed. And then if they do talk about it, Tom, what's the thing they focus on? Do you know that it's privately owned? Do you know how horrifying that is, that the Fed has private owners?
That's not the problem with the Fed. The Fed is not socialistic enough. No, what? No, that is not the problem. And plus, it's not, I mean, we get into the thing about the ownership of the Fed. I mean, I know you've done stuff on that. It's a weird hybrid, we'll say, but even that is not the problem. I mean, the Congress created the thing. Congress could close it tomorrow, but unfortunately, they probably won't.
It's not like the president appoints the head of General Motors. Well, actually, when they took it over, but pick a different private company that was never bailed out. Whereas with the Federal Reserve, that's a political process that picks the leadership. So again, yes, it is true that that the banks do own the Fed. Let me say one real thing. I do understand why people point that out, that it would be weird if pharmaceutical companies literally own the FDA. That would be weird. And so I get how when people hear that private banks literally own the Fed and get dividend payments, that's kind of shocking. But like you say, Tom, like among the things that it does wrong, like the fact that they've just focused on that as if, hey, this is how we know something's fishy here, is kind of ironic.
Right. And, I understand the audit the Fed movement and stuff like that, but honestly, what the Fed does out in the open is the thing that is the most important anyway. The activities it engages in and all the economists who weave all these convoluted justifications for what the Fed is doing out in the open, that really is what's significant. Now, the issue of the Depression and what ended it, you can read that in Bob's book, and first of all, in the little cartoon that Michael Malice and I have, you should check that out at pigseries.com, pig for politically incorrect guide, pigseries.com. We do have a little segment at the end about why some conservatives will say maybe the New Deal didn't get us out of the Depression, but World War II did. And we have a little segment where we explain, no, that's not true either. And as soon as you start arguing that, you're justifying every stimulus program from now until the cows come home. I just love that expression, so I snuck it in there. So we don't want to go down that road. So on the show notes page, I will include a link to an episode I did on this exact subject about why World War II cannot be said to have brought the country out of the Great Depression. So
can I say, Tom, that surprised me when you said the anecdote about Hannity, because, to me, that was the standard conservative response. Like, no, it wasn't the New Deal that ended the Depression. It was World War II. And it's at first, like you say, that sounds like it fits in with conservative, because Conservatives are big war hawks, and we go, show Hitler who's boss and whatever. And so it makes sense that righteous flexing of the U.S. might would also solve the Depression as an offshoot. But like you said, if you do concede that, then you just justified Keynesianism, which you could say, well, maybe that's right. But I'm pointing out it's sort of a contradiction to say, no, big government spending programs in the 30s didn't do it, but really big government spending in the 40s is what did.
Right, exactly.
You're saying Paul Krugman's right.
Yeah, you're digging your own grave. Don't do that, okay? And because, as you say, it's possible that you might be right, but you're not right. And so you're digging your own grave for no good reason. So we do cover that. So the show notes page is tomwoods.com/1847. And on that page, we'll have the cartoon, the episode we did on the Great Depression and the New Deal, Michael Malice and I. And I'll also link to Bob's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. I'll have the stuff on World War II. More stuff on business cycles. This is maybe the show notes page of 2021 so far, tomwoods.com/1847. Bob, thank you for joining me a very last minute. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I got to go work on my third pig book now.
Okay, folks, something very interesting to tell you about before we go. This is a children's book that I think some of you folks might find interesting. And the author says that it's kind of inspired in a way by me and by my insistence that there's a difference between just surviving biologically and living a human life. And it is a libertarian, kind of liberty-oriented children's book geared at kids between 4 and 10 years old. And the concept and the moral of the story is very easy to understand. Is it enough merely to survive, or ought we to live even if that means taking certain risks in order to live life as it's meant to be lived? And the key question that parents might want to discuss with their kids at the end of the book is, what does it really mean to live? What makes life so precious and amazing? Well, the book is called The Tale of Two Brothers and subtitled Dare to Live. So check that baby out at tale2brothers.com. That's tale2brothers.com. I'll link to that on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1847. And now I am a big supporter of this book, but I'm promoting it in particular because that's what I said I would do for folks who use my link when they get their web hosting. And you get some nice SEO juice for your site when I link to you at tomwoods.com. I give you a whole bunch of free video tutorials to help you get up and running as a website owner or blogger, plus membership in my private bloggers group where we help each other out. So you can get all these bonuses that'll really help you get up and running with your website as long as you check out tomwoods.com/publicity before you get that site. Before you get started, check out tomwoods.com/publicity. So go do that. And tomorrow it is our old friend, Tom DiLorenzo.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.